Larry, you want to get us started?
All right. I'd like to welcome everybody. This is Larry Hardison from the National Service Learning Clearinghouse, and I am happy to have this next webinar in our series with the Campus Compact and Julie Plout. In that, I would like to introduce Julie Plout.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks, everyone, for joining us. As Larry said, I'm Julie Plout from Campus Compact, and we serve as the Higher Education Program Advisor to the Clearinghouse. And we are going to mute everybody's phone except for the presenter, so we have less noise on the line.
Yes, I did forget that. Hold on a second.
Before you do that, can we ask a question about getting into the webinar?
Yes.
It's asking us to download a program. Is it common to download a program, install a program onto our computer?
Right, yeah. You shouldn't have to worry about that. You can download the program. It won't do any problems to you.
But we can see it without downloading it, or you're saying we do that?
You do.
Okay.
So, I also have a question before we mute my phone. Are we going to have to listen to this entire thing through my phone?
Yes.
Yeah, so there will be a PowerPoint you can see on screen, and there will be the talking you'll hear through the phone line.
If I want to listen, and then at a certain point you're going to open it up so there can be a discussion at the end?
I'll give you instructions in a moment. Let me just welcome you all. We're really excited about the topic of the webinar. As you know, there's lots of excitement about the presidential election, but citizen involvement is important all year round, every year. And so this webinar is focusing on how campuses can support the development of students' political knowledge, skills, and dispositions, while actively engaging them and addressing public issues. And doing all of this as part of their academic experience. We're really delighted to have two presenters with us today who have great experience and knowledge to share. Tom Ehrlich, who is at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and Rick Battistoni of Providence College. And I will give you a couple of logistical hints now. One is that you can submit questions at any point in the webinar. If you look to the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the PowerPoint slides to the left, and on the right, below the list of participants, you'll see a box. There's chat, and then there's Q&A. If you click on Q&A so it appears blue, you can type in and submit a question anytime. If you would put your cursor on the lower box, the smaller box, type in your question, and then hit send. And we welcome questions to be submitted in that way at any point during the webinar. Tom and Rick may answer some questions throughout, and then there will also be time for questions at the end. As we mentioned, all your lines will be muted, and if there's a time when you want to raise a question vocally instead of by typing it in, or when you're called on to volunteer a comment, the way to unmute your line is to press *6. And then when you're done speaking, if you wouldn't mind pressing *7 again.
Actually, I'm sorry, that's reversed. It's *7 to unmute your line,
I'm
and
sorry.
*6 to mute it back.
So *7 to unmute, *6 to mute. And one other logistical note, this entire thing is being recorded so that it will be available to other people online if they want to hear what happened. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the leadership over to Tom, who's speaking first.
Yeah, Tom, unmute your line after I mute everybody, please.
Thanks very much, Julie.
The conference has been muted.
in the book. Please feel free at any time to type in a question, and I'll be able to see it on the screen. Educating for Democracy, preparing undergraduates for responsible political engagement. What do we mean by political engagement? Let's do a little poll to see how you, the participants here, define political engagement. On your screen, you'll see 7 items, beginning with volunteering for a candidate in a local, state, or national election, and ending with boycotting products. I'd ask you to rate each of those 7 quickly, and remember, there's no right answer. This is just what do you think? Ranging from clearly apolitical, which is a 1, to a 5, which is clearly political. So if you'd go down the list of the 7, rating them as quickly as you can, we'll be grateful, and then we'll come back in a minute to talk about the results. Okay, can we see the results now of the poll?
Yeah, they're being submitted. Hold on a second.
Well, let's take number 6. See that someone thought organizing a grassroots campaign to stop domestic violence was essentially clearly apolitical. Would one of the 2 people who had that view unmute your phone and tell us why? And to remember to unmute your phone, you press *7. I also would like someone who rated this a 5, meaning clearly political, to speak out why you think it's clearly political. And again, unmute your phone by pressing *7.
All right, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yep.
Okay. I was the one that put clearly apolitical because it could be considered as political as well, but I thought it was more or less a right as an individual to stop what they would consider a bad thing in their community and didn't consider organizing a campaign to stop domestic violence political, unless you step over and start doing more lobbying towards a political entity.
Got it. And how about somebody who viewed this as very political?
Well, I'll join in on that. I actually put everything was very political. I'm a very strong believer that the personal is political, and anything that we do that has consequences on others in the social is indeed political.
Well, that's a nice contrast, and it does underscore that each of us brings to our teaching a view about what is political or non-political, which is fine as long as we are clear ourselves in articulating to our students what we mean by political engagement, and clear that students may come with very different views themselves. There isn't any right answer, of course, but we want to be sure that our own perspectives are understood by our students and that their perspectives are understood by us. This is one way, and I've seen it used in a wide range of different courses to help at the very beginning students think through what they think is political, whether they agree with the last speaker who said that the personal is political, everything is political, or with the former one which said that it's a much narrower band. And in our own book, we give our definition, which involves working for systemic change in public policy issues as well as electoral politics. But it isn't as broad as the last speaker, nor indeed as narrow as the first speaker. And again, it is important to articulate those views. We encourage you to do so against the background of what we call the open inquiry imperative. If you stop for a second and think, what's the last conversation you had about a political issue, some hot button issue, Iraq, healthcare, the economy, and then ask yourself, did you change your view about that issue as a result of the conversation? I've asked that to groups of hundreds of people over the last months, and I have yet to find more than one or two people who raise their hand when I ask, did you change your view? Overwhelmingly, when we talk about politics, we talk with people who think just like we do, and we don't change our views. We hear about politics from the media and from candidates. The difference in the academy is that there's a chance to hear a wide range of perspectives, and it's absolutely crucial, in our view, that we maintain this imperative of open inquiry against the background of the basic academic values of not only pluralism and academic freedom, but a strong sense of rational inquiry, which is very different from what we hear about politics most of the time. And it is why we believe educating students for political engagement is so important in colleges and universities, because that's where they can learn the knowledge, the skills, the dispositions in a context which doesn't have the biases that the media and so often that candidates themselves do. At the same time, we underscore that if you have a Learn and Serve program, you're operating under some regulations that actually require nonpartisanship, and it's important that you look and understand what those regulations are. But at this point, we simply underscore that the importance of that imperative of open inquiry. And again, I remind you, if you want to have questions or comments, please give us those as we're talking. Rick and I will do our best to weave our thoughts about your questions into our comments.
Tom, before you move to the next, to talk about the Carnegie project, could I say a word here?
Please do.
This is Rick. One thing I like about the poll, and actually I have done for a number of years, both in courses and in workshops, a variation on that exercise where I have a list of 15 items, so it's a much more extensive list, and ask students to rank order them 1 to 15 and then place themselves along a continuum, and then we talk about it, is that it offers students an opportunity to exercise voice and to, in a way that doesn't necessarily polarize or is not full of spin, the kinds of things students really don't like about dialogue, and allows a pluralism of perspective. It's a really effective way to have a sharing of diverse perspectives about how we even talk about or define and perceive politics and civic engagement. So I really think it's an effective device to enter into that conversation in the first place.
The Carnegie Political Engagement Project was a 3-year effort that grew out of an earlier book that my colleagues and I did called Educating Citizens. And in that book, those of you who've seen it know, focused on 12 campuses that we think do a particularly good job of civic engagement generally. But overwhelmingly, in the course of that book, we found the civic engagement was individual activity, cleaning up a park, tutoring a kid, working in a community kitchen. We found no campus that focused on public policy and politics broadly defined. And so we identified groups of courses and programs, and RICS is one of the very strongest at Providence College, and studied them over the course of 3 years to examine how best faculty can infuse their courses and programs with necessary knowledge and skills and dispositions. And we did that looking at a wide range of different courses and a wide range of different institutions. And so I'm very comfortable in saying that political engagement can be taught through almost any different field in the humanities, the social sciences, the natural sciences, or professional fields. And we saw good examples of that occurring. The good news and the core key findings that we came away with at the end of this 3-year study is that students in the courses showed significant gains in political knowledge and understanding, first, in political skills of various kinds, second, and in a number of dimensions of political motivation, including what we call political efficacy, the extent to which you think politics is part of your identity. Naturally, the gains were strongest with students without significant interest to start with, but even students who had very high initial interest showed substantial gains all across the board. No less important, particularly for those in public institutions, but private ones as well, these courses and programs supported the learning of the students without creating significant changes in their partisan identification, Republican to Democratic or vice versa, or where they put themselves on a conservative liberal spectrum. Actually, individual changed over time, but we did not find any evidence of partisan bias. As I'm sure you know, there are various critics who claim that inevitably teaching for political engagement means that there will be partisan bias. We found clear evidence that that's not a valid criticism. You will see the survey the before and after survey that we use in an online document supplement that's available, and you'll see the resource at the end of this presentation, but it's one of more than 50 documents that are available online free from the Carnegie Foundation website. The poll that we did first is another one, and Rick will be referring to a number of others over the course of this presentation. I want to stress the range of different fields that can be used to educate for democracy. Ann Colby, my colleague here, and I have been working with 23 faculty for California Campus Compact in fields as diverse as agriculture, engineering, as well as English, history, political science. All of them are seeking to enhance their courses in terms of political engagement, and have done so in enormously impressive ways.
So that's to me, right?
Right, please do.
Okay, so this is Rick once again. What we thought we would do is talk a little bit about how these and other courses can, especially service learning courses, can provide exercises and activities where students can increase their political education, where we can use a service learning course and connect exercises and activities in a traditional service learning course to help educate for democracy. And as Tom mentioned, most of the research and the work in educating for democracy is kind of focused on three areas: political knowledge, skills, and the development of either dispositions or motivation. I think voice is also very important. I said that a minute ago, and I can say more later on or in response to questions. But we thought it would be useful to talk about ways in which you can strengthen the political education or civic education that students would get in a service learning course, no matter what the discipline and no matter where it is. And so we'll have a few examples kind of described. You can get a much more extensive description of the exercise or the assignment from the Carnegie website, and we'll be showing you how to get there at the end of the session. So when we talk about political knowledge, as a political scientist, when political scientists talk about political knowledge, usually they're referring to knowledge about political institutions, and so often they ask people questions like, name your senator or representative. But when we think about political knowledge, particularly connected to students' work in communities, one of the most important elements of knowledge is a knowledge around the issues, around the public problems or issues that create the very need for service in the first place, and around which different community stakeholders have different perspectives about what the issue is, what the problem is, and how you go about solving it. So one of the ways that you can increase political knowledge in a service learning course is to get students to think about how they connect their working communities to public problems or public issues. And there are a couple of ways that you can do that. If you have a course where you have the luxury of beginning with students' passions or interests, you can have students choose an issue of interest, then conduct research that helps them understand the history behind the issue, and then they can select service work that connects to that issue. There you're really kind of allowing student voice to drive the selection of service. A lot of courses don't allow that kind of luxury or that kind of time. So an alternative, and one that I've used often, is to have students who are already placed at agencies or community-based organizations or schools to assign those students to come up with a public problem or public issue statement for the organization that the student is working with. And again, I can show you what an example of that might be. But that is, students would then look into their organization, do interviews with staff and stakeholders, and get a sense of what the public problem or issue is that organization is attempting to address, and even doing research on alternative ways of addressing the issue besides the kind of work that students are doing through their service. So that's one type of exercise to increase political knowledge. Again, at the end of the session, we'll refer you to other kinds of exercises. When we think about skills that we might develop in students, there are a whole host of skills that have to do with political analysis and judgment or organizational analysis. One of the skills that I think is really important involves not only analysis but public speaking and communication. There's an exercise that I've been using in my classes, and I've actually done a bookended exercise with this. At the beginning of the semester, I asked students to bring to class and present an artifact that they think exemplifies popular culture or American culture's ideas about democracy or politics or political engagement. Very brief presentation. It allows students to think about and then bring and present an artifact. And then what I've been doing lately is having a bookend at the end of the semester, ask them to come with an artifact that represents their own perspective on democracy or politics, their own philosophy of political engagement. And those are usually different artifacts that they present. It, again, gets them in the habit of speaking and listening, which are important political skills, and can allow for some dialogue and deliberation around those kinds of things. The second assignment or exercise that's on your screen, on your slide, has to do with organizational analysis. And we really think that's an important skill because we find that students of this generation often come not connecting who they are and what they do to politics. They tend to be anti-political. They may think that politics is dirty or is a turnoff, and there's evidence that suggests that students choose service as a kind of antidote or alternative to as either ineffectual politics or partisan or spin-oriented politics. But we also know that students of this generation tend not only to be anti-political but anti-institutional. A lot of students who get involved in service want to plunge into that service, they want to make a difference, and they don't think about themselves as parts of institutions or organizations. And it's really important if they're to be effective politically or even in their service to understand organizational structures, to understand the text and the context of the organization within which they're working or the institutions within which they're working. This is a finding that a lot of people, Robert Bella and his colleagues in the Good Society, talk about the importance of institutional analysis and understanding. And so an exercise that I've used in service learning courses is assigning a paper or an analysis where students have to understand their organization's mission, its history, their strategies for addressing issues and creating change. That involves them often having to interview members of the staff and even clients or citizens, members of their organization, in order to get a better sense of the organization within which they're working and have a better understanding of organizational analysis. So those are a couple of exercises aimed at those kinds of skills. Also important is to connect service learning courses to pedagogies that will really increase students' skills around communication, leadership, and I think particularly to encourage pedagogies that encourage democratic deliberation and decision-making. And so not an exercise, but more like a pedagogy, is to have students present in class or to lead class sessions, to facilitate sessions. And what I do is have pairs of students, one facilitating and one serving as a vibes watcher, as a way of leading class discussion. And when you alternate that, what I found is that it increases everybody's responsibility in the class, because if students are going to be leading discussion down the road, they're going to be much more responsible discussion participants, because when they come to lead, they'll want other students to participate participate. And so you can create a sense of horizontal responsibility, which I think is also an important political disposition to have. Please jump in, Tom.
2 points. One, when we began the work that led to the book Educating for Democracy, we heard over and over again that the reason young people weren't involved with politics was because they thought it was dirty and corrupt and they couldn't make a difference. When we started interviewing students around the country, we heard some of that, true, but the much more dominant message we heard from students and from faculty was they didn't have the opportunities to engage in political work the way they had in civic activities more generally, and they didn't have the encouragement from faculty and their institutions to be engaged in politics the way they were encouraged to do individual community service. I think that's good news because that means, and we saw it in our work, that when students do have the opportunities, are encouraged, they really will be engaged in politics, just as we have seen an explosion of interest in the individual civic activities. The other point I would stress is over and over again we saw that on the whole, colleges and universities are not very good in educating for political skills, the kinds that Rick has just been talking about. These are skills that are life skills as well as good for political engagement, but they are enormously important and on the whole not part of undergraduate curricula at most institutions.
Yeah, good point, Tom. And what I would say also about your first point is that we've often said that students aren't engaged because they're not motivated. So we kind of flip it around, and what the Carnegie study and a number of other studies have been showing is that it's actually the opportunity to participate that creates motivation, not the other way around. And so the more opportunities, the more motivated students tend to be, and I think that's true of political engagement as well. Well, let me talk about another exercise having to do with skills around teamwork and collaboration. And this is an exercise that I actually gained from a colleague, Maida Mendel-Reyes, who teaches at Berea College. It's a coalition building simulation, and it's really coalition building. I think is a critical skill for political efficacy, especially in a diverse democracy like ours, where you have individuals with diverse values and interests, but individuals who have to find common ground in order to address matters of mutual concern. Now, sometimes in a service learning course, if you have students teamed, that is placed at sites as a team, you can create that kind of coalition and collaboration through team-based community projects, team-based presentations, or analyses. But where that isn't the case, this simulation really has worked for me in classes to get students to think about how they form coalitions, even with people that are unlikely members of a coalition. What I've done is I've asked students to identify an issue on campus that they think needs to be addressed, a public issue on campus. Then the students identify who the stakeholders would be. So if the issue has to do with course registration and making that easier, or whatever the issue is, students then brainstorm who the main stakeholders would be. And then once they're identified, then each student has to take on the role of one of those different stakeholders. They have to develop a line of argument, and they simply go around with their lines of argument and figure out who might be aligned with them based on a simple statement that they make in their role play. And then at the end of the coalition, they think about building exercise. They think about what it means to align with people who may have different interests, how one might be aligned, how you bring stakeholders who see things differently and have different interests into a common ground and into decision-making together.
I might stress that we have found, just as Rick is suggesting, encouraging students to take the role of a stakeholder in a political environment viewed different than the one they automatically would identify with is an enormously powerful learning experience, being forced to articulate the views of that different perspective, defend them against others, is itself powerful way to learn about political engagement.
Thanks, Tom. I want to finally give an example of exercise aimed at tapping into questions of motivation and disposition. And here I think we have an area that is often unexplored. And it's often unexplored because it does get a little dicey to talk about areas of values or where people feel, even people's political vocation or calling. But my feeling is that all the knowledge and skills in the world won't take you anywhere unless you're motivated, unless you have a motivation to act in a particular way, unless you have direction. And so it's important to at least work on students' development of their motivation, development of how they see their identities as political beings, as citizens. Again, without being partisan, without violating those notions of open inquiry that Tom opened up with and started with. So one of the ways I do that is through a three-stage political autobiography assignment that I use in my classes. In the first stage, I set up a series of prompts that are aimed at getting students to write a very brief narrative about their basic political values and ideas, their commitments to action around them. I have the opportunity to set up courses through something like a WebCT or a Blackboard. We have a system called Angel. And students can drop those political autobiographies in a Dropbox. They do that first stage. Then at the second stage, I pair students up randomly. They have access to each other's autobiography. They read them ahead of time, and then they come into class and they engage in what I call a one-to-one conversation, a basic tool that community organizers use. I do a little workshop on what a one-to-one is. They get a chance to have a conversation with another student, a student who may have very different values, very different motivations, and they're asked to explore their different stories and interests and try to come to some common ground, some common understanding, some ways in which things that they share or things that they have in common. And that alone has been really revelatory to me because students say, in response to that one-to-one, that they were very nervous about having a conversation with a fellow student, especially someone they didn't know or had no idea. And after reading an autobiography that seemed to put them at different ends of the political spectrum, and yet after a 20-minute conversation, they felt much more comfortable sharing their story of motivation, what their political calling or vocation might be, and feeling more confident that they could reach common ground even with people with someone else who would seem to be diametrically opposed to them in terms of their political identification. Then what I do at the third stage is I ask them to interview an elder, someone who represents a generation at least one removed from their own. Again, comparing their political autobiographies with this elder. And this has been a really great exercise because students have had an opportunity to interview a grandparent or an aunt or uncle or a close friend that they hadn't talked with about politics, because as we know, we're all told that political conversations are taboo, oftentimes not to be mixed with family or friendly conversations. So this is an exercise that I found quite effective to increase students' sense of their motivation and to tap into those motivations that students have. I'll be referring to where you can find some of these and other kinds of exercises and assignments that can bolster the political education and democratic education for students, most of which are on the Carnegie website. Tom, you want to add anything at this point?
No, I think that's absolutely right. The only dimension I might underscore is that we have seen students come with a high degree of what I'll call relativism, saying, here's my view, and listening probably politely to Rick's view and saying, oh, that's Rick's view, but not really engaging. Saying whatever view you have is fine, but I'm not really going to try to persuade you, or I'm not going to listen hard to you with the notion that I may be persuaded myself. The kind of exercise that Rick suggests, and we have a number of others in the materials as well, press students to not simply say, here's my view, there's your view, and walk away, but rather engage. Politics is an active, involving, participatory set of activities, and it's important that students learn how to try to persuade on the one hand and be persuaded on the other. That's not a process that takes place generally outside of the university setting, all the more important why it should occur in our classrooms and in our co-curricular programs. And incidentally, I should stress that a number of the programs we studied are co-curricular. The programs generally range from a 2-year program at the University of Maryland to a 1-year program, 2-year program at the University of Massachusetts, rather, 1-year program at Maryland, summer programs. Most of them are single courses, of summer co-curricular as well. We've seen different perspectives and different ways that those occur. Let's just ask whether I'm familiar with Carrie Rothstein, Fisher, and Kathleen Daly on collectivistic and individualistic work, and I'm not familiar with that. So, Michelle, Michelle Herzog, if you want to unmute your phone and tell us about it, or do it by writing, that would be just fine.
And this is the time that we wanted to leave open for questions. We want to leave a lot of time for questions and conversation or contributions, and you can either use the Q&A part of on the webinar, as Julie indicated, typing in your question in the box below that and sending it, or if you want to ask a question over the phone, just unmute your phone, *7, and you can ask a question or make a comment at this point.
Hello, this is Michelle Herzog. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, this is very intimidating, but kind of fun. I raised a question about the collectivistic and individualistic orientation work. It's something we've been delving in deeply here at the Los Angeles County Office of Education to address achievement gaps and looking at diverse learners, diverse learning styles as it pertains to culture. And their work goes very deeply into those discussions of different cultures operating from different learning styles. So we know that some cultures operate very collectivistically. You know, it's about family, it's about working in groups, it's about working for the good of the group, rather than an individualistic where people tend to be a little bit more individual in their work, independent, almost competitive at times. And how does that match or mismatch what practices are conducted in classrooms? The kids are coming from a collectivistic nature in their upbringing and culture, but yet the classroom is operated from a very independent, almost competitive framework. It's a mismatch for them. And that's typically where most classrooms operate. Who has the best score, who's the student of the month, who's got the best paper, kids working individually. So what we're trying to look at more deeply is looking at teacher practice and how does that help our kids, particularly our African American and Latino students who are performing well below the levels of our Asian and white students, and looking at those aspects. So when you brought up the issue of coalition building, and I think that's a real strength of service learning, or any activity that encourages people and kids to work in groups, work collaboratively, I think it becomes a good match for kids from collectivistic cultures.
That makes a lot of sense. Karen Walesek has asked us, what do you do if you have a population that's of one system of belief and an isolated student with an opposing view that's seen in a negative light? That's an enormously important question, Karen, and I'm delighted you asked. Let me start and then turn to Rick, because I began by focusing on what we call this imperative of open inquiry, precisely because so oftentimes there are minority views and they feel silenced in one way or another. They don't feel that it is comfortable for them to express that view because it is a minority one. And as faculty, I think we need to be particularly sensitive to helping students who are in a minority in terms of their perspective articulate that view, whatever it is, and help them defend it. If it's one of the hot-button issues like abortion, for example, to be sure that that person can express her view, and if the student seems to be having trouble doing it oneself as a teacher, and so that you express as strongly as you can that view to help the student. And I know, Rick, you use the Vibes Watcher as a way to help ensure that there's a minimum of oppression in this dimension.
Yeah, and the other thing that I try to do is that I try to bolster, as the instructor, I try to bolster minority views myself by even if I don't necessarily adhere to them myself, adding to or supporting those, and bringing in views that haven't been expressed by the classroom. Because oftentimes you'll have a class where the systems of belief or the perspectives represented don't reflect all the perspectives that are out there, and so and this is not always easy, but you can do it yourself, or you can create role plays, as Tom mentioned earlier, where people are assigned to perspectives that they may not hold themselves, and that's a way of bringing in pluralistic belief systems in a classroom. But it's really important. It's important that students don't feel isolated. In the same way that it's important that students who find themselves in the majority don't feel comfortable.
Yes, that is no less important, that those who are in the majority feel pressed and uncomfortable a bit of the time, because that's part of the learning process.
Right. Are there other comments or questions that people have?
I'm muted. It's okay. I can't. Oh, you just can't click on it?
We can hear you. You have to press *7 to unmute your phone.
Michelle just talked about the framework of Michael Foulon about the need for all students to establish a moral imperative for all voices to be heard. You might write out where those interested would find that work, Michelle. I know Nathan Fine refers to the University of Minnesota Leadership Program, which is a terrific program. It's one that emphasizes civic engagement generally, but also political involvement, and is wonderful. There are leadership programs across the country. University of Miami of Ohio has another one that is effective in this dimension. So I'm glad you raised that, Mason.
Yes, may I ask a question?
Please do.
So I just actually emailed this in, but do you believe that teachers should attempt to be objective in their representation of content and or curriculum and attempt to hide their own political
in two parts. In terms of trying to be objective, I would say yes. It is important as teachers that we do try to be objective, that we too base our judgments on reasoned analysis, on evidence, and that we recognize, though, our own biases and try to be as clear as we can about them. Some faculty believe that if they reveal their political views, that will create such an atmosphere in the class that it's hard for students with different views to express themselves. And so I've watched some faculty with very passionate views themselves keep those views from the students. And indeed, I know that happens because at the end of the class, the course, students are asked, what are the faculty members' views? We did this, and students didn't know or were wrong. On the other hand, I've heard a number of faculty say, no, I'm going to tell the students what I think, where I am politically, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democratic, but I am going to stress that I not only welcome but affirmatively want their views based on reasoned analysis, and whether those views are the same or different than mine is not the issue. It's rather how well they're able to articulate them. And that seems to me a critical distinction.
Yeah, I'd like to complicate that. I definitely am on the side of the latter in my own teaching, and think that it's actually, I would just argue that in many ways it's impossible to be objective. Maybe some of those teachers fooled their students in terms of, appearing to be more neutral than they were. But, just by the mere choices we make of curriculum, the attention we give topics.
I take your point. I think it's very well said that we make choices all the time that result from our biases. We need to do the best we can to be objective. We need to articulate as much as we can what our biases are. But having said that, you're absolutely right. All our courses have, by the materials we choose to assign or not assign, the speakers we bring to class or not bring, that says a lot. Having mentioned that, I would underscore that there are ways to help ameliorate, and speakers is one of them. I was surprised the extent to which students in the 21 courses and programs that we studied were really viewed outside speakers coming to their class as instructive of perspectives different than their own. Students identified with the speakers even when their views weren't the same and learned from them. So it's a good way to balance one's own perspective in a course or a program.
I guess I would just add to this conversation. I kind of agree with the questioner that it's impossible for people to be objective, but I do think the most important thing to convey to students is that their voice is important, and that my role as an instructor is to get them to be as effective at arguing from their own perspective, arguing their own values and making arguments that are defended, that have evidence behind them, so that they can be effective in the world. It's not my job to tell them what they should think or to convince them that they should think what I think, but they should be effective thinkers, persuaders, deliberators in the public realm. And so my role is to help them be stronger from their own perspective. And that's what I try to convey to students.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This issue of objectivity, bias, when we began the work that led to the book Educating for Democracy, we knew this was an issue, but we didn't realize how important it was. And in the book now we devote 2 chapters to open inquiry, how to deal with it, including some suggestions in response to John Kitchen's very thoughtful issue raised. How can you be objective? How can you really be objective? What does objective mean? So those two chapters are our effort to try to grapple with these questions, realizing that they're complex in any field. Other questions or comments that you want us to deal with? These have been very helpful and thoughtful.
We have a question from Karen Walasek, I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly, asking about whether we examine political parties and how they frame issues based on emotional frameworks rather than intellectual ones. Tom, do you have examples from the Carnegie Project of courses that looked at political parties? I don't teach courses around political parties, but...
Well, several of the courses that we studied, one that comes immediately to mind looks at the politics of San Francisco. Another one does the same thing in terms of politics in Chicago. And in both cases, they look at particular issues from the perspective of how parties and politicians analyze those issues. First of all, have they analyzed them, and then the students do their own analysis. And to some degree, yes, they are framed around emotional rather than intellectual, though I think it's not a total dichotomy. Emotion and the cognitive are interacting in many of the frames, but the student's job is to examine carefully the issues. To what degree is it appealing solely to emotion? To what degree is it intellectual? And those two courses are good examples of how that happens. And I see it was asked whether the PowerPoint will be available, and the answer is yes. And I think Rick is going to now give us some information on how to get the other resources that are available.
Yeah, let me do a little wrap up, and if there are some really urgent questions, you can type them in. But I think the most important thing to come away with is and it's something that's come through in my own research and work, and certainly in Tom's and in the Carnegie Project, is that while service learning is a really valuable vehicle for civic education, for political education, it doesn't happen by itself. It just doesn't automatically happen. And so the most important thing that someone who's engaged in community-based or service learning can do is to be intentional about what political or civic ends they have in mind, and then making sure that courses, assignments, everything that's done is designed with those ends in mind. And we found that where that's the case, in a wide range of courses at a wide range of institutions, that intentionality and being intentional about how you design your course, your service learning activities around political ends, knowledge, skills, dispositions, values, can make a world of difference in terms of outcomes. Let me talk about some of the resources that are available to you. There is the book Educating for Democracy that Tom mentioned, which is a narrative of the 21 course and program project that the Carnegie Foundation engaged in over a 3-year period. But More specifically, there are supplemental documents from the Political Engagement Project, over 50 of them, including assignments, activities, paper assignments. There are samples of student work that come out of these courses and programs, materials for evaluation. Those can be found also at the Carnegie website, and you have the URL available. And again, when you get the PowerPoint, you can just copy and paste it into your web browser and go right to that page. And it's just a wealth of documentation there that can be used, adapted, revised as you see fit. To learn more about the California Campus Compact and Carnegie Foundation Faculty Fellows Program, which kind of follows up on the Educating for Democracy book and work, you have a URL there through California Campus Compact, and you can see a list of the fellows, where they're at, what disciplines they're in, and the kind of work that they've been doing. Several years ago, I wrote a volume for Campus Compact called Civic Engagement Across the Curriculum. It not only tries to explore different disciplinary frameworks that can connect to political and civic engagement, but it also has a series of activities and exercises that can be used in any kind of service learning course aimed at political or civic engagement. I want to also mention something not on the slide. It just came out, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, AAC&U, puts out quarterly something called peer review. And the latest peer review that came out is on student political engagement. It has a lead essay by Ann Colby, who is one of Tom's colleagues in the Carnegie Political Engagement Project. It has a series of short essays around political engagement, including some examples from different campuses. You can find most of them online if you don't get peer review at your institution or in wherever you are, by just going to www.aacu.org, go to publications and look for peer review, and the latest issue will come up, and several of the essays in the volume are available online. Not all are, but quite a few of them are. Then finally, you can find guidance. Those of you who are supported either through CNCS, particularly through CNCS, Learn and Serve America grants or whatever, you can get guidance about what restrictions exist. If you're trying to do political engagement work or political education work, you need to avoid you need to avoid areas of legislative lobbying and partisan politics. The URL on your slide can help you with that. And if you have questions, you can get in touch with Kirsten Breckenridge, who's on the line listening in, and she can answer any questions you might have about what restrictions might exist if you're a Learn and Serve fundee from the corporation. I've flipped it over to the contact list. You can get in touch with any of us at our email addresses to follow up with questions, to ask for resources that you couldn't find from the resource slides, or things that you might have particular questions about that either Tom or I addressed. Tom, you have anything else to add?
Well, let me only thank Campus Compact on the one hand, the Clearinghouse on the other, and you for the experience that we've just had over the last hour. I want to stress, on the one hand, I have seen in an enormously wide range of different courses, faculty saying there is a potential public policy issue here, and our students are going to address it and think about it, and all of a sudden they are doing political engagement in a very active way. The other part is that I've been working especially with 8 campuses as part of the American Democracy Project, which is sponsored by the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, and the project as a whole is some 220 campuses, but I've been working particularly with 8 of them that say we want to educate all our students, and not just a few of them, but all of them, to be politically engaged. And they have, over the past 2 years, developed courses, programs, starting from those that welcome incoming students, co-curricular ones throughout the year, courses emphasizing the first-year experience, ones in their general education, and ones in their major, with the result that I really am quite persuaded that on these 8 campuses, students, virtually all of them, are coming away with significant education in the knowledge, the skills, the motivation to be politically engaged. So it is possible on a campus-wide basis as well as, of course, on a program or individual campus basis. Thank you again for the pleasure of your company over the last hour and 10 minutes.
Julie, you want to close?
Yeah. Well, thank you both, Tom and Rick, for sharing all that you did, and thanks to many of the participants for sharing resources and questions and comments. I will stress that we will be sending all the registered participants the PowerPoint slides as a follow-up. We'll also be sending you a link for an evaluation form so that you can let us know what was valuable and what suggestions you have for future webinars. And we're always interested in improving as well as hearing what you thought of a particular. And so we very much look forward to input in that way. And just to say thanks, all of the activities and exercises that were shared today do support students' political engagement and the development of their skills to address the issues that they care about in ways that are consistent with the Learn and Serve America guidelines, just for those of you who have that concern. And underscore the point Tom was making at the end, we can do a lot at the course and program level. It's also critical that we create campus cultures that support open deliberation and dialogue about public issues, because that, as the Carnegie Project found, having a campus climate that supports the work happening more intensively within courses and programs is where we see the greatest impact on students. And that's bodes well for our democracy. So thank you all for the commitment you have to this work. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to being in touch with the follow-up material soon. So thanks, everybody.